everyone. Um, Thank you for that introduction, Tina. So my book is called India Connected, and I should say I'm happy to sign the book after this event downstairs. But the book really is about smartphones, or looks at India through the prism of smartphones. But it is an India book, and the reason why I say that is I'm not a tech guy. I'm a journalist, and the book essentially takes a bigger picture look at where India is headed over the next 10, 15, 20 years because of technology. So let me begin with a question. How many of you here discovered the internet for the first time on a smartphone? Nobody. How many of you then discovered the internet on a PC and a dial-up connection? Every single person, right? What does that tell me? That question gives me a crucial bit of information about who you all are. So in the year 2000, only 2% of Indians could afford PCs, personal computers. A similar percentage of Indians could afford landline connections. And obviously, you need a PC and a landline phone. You put them together, and then you get a dial-up connection. So because PCs were so, only for India's rich, essentially, because of that, the internet was restricted to a very small percentage of Indians. And as Tina just pointed out, that was 20 million Indians. If India would have continued along the trajectory that it was going at that stage, I would have estimated by now we would have had maybe 60, 70, 80, 90 million Indians online with PCs and some form of a phone hardline connection. But the fact remains that very few Indians would still be online. And so, in a sense, all of you, if I were to call you all the 2%ers, so India's rich, basically, that's what you are very similar in your experience with the internet as people in the West were. So you look at, again, how a typical family in America would have discovered the internet. In the mid-90s, they would have gotten computers, they already had telephone landlines, and then from there they graduated to cable and DSL and broadband, and then routers were invented and they got wireless internet, and then they sort of evolved from there to 3G on a phone and 4G on a phone and high-tech smartphones. It was a steady progression in how they were evolving with the internet. It was an evolution. For most Indians, they're not going to go through an evolution, they're going to go through a revolution. So take yourselves out of that equation, because you, again, are India's 2%. For most Indians, the 98% or the 90%, they are discovering the internet, as you all know, on very cheap smartphones. And these cheap smartphones are not Apple iPhones that cost $1,000. These are the likes of the JioPhone that you can lease for $23, as you know, or phones that are made by Micromax or Xiaomi or one of the Indian and Chinese companies whose names you all know so much about here. You take those cheap smartphones and cheap data plans, and then you have an explosion of people getting online. Why is this important? The reason why this is important, I'll tell you two things. One, as I was saying, the people who are now getting online are mostly rural. They are women often, because the Indian internet was cut off for women. Even 2 or 3 years ago, 70% of Indian internet users were men. In villages, 90% of Indian internet users were men. So women have long been cut off. These are the divides that we see so often in India. There's the urban-rural divide, the rich-poor divide, the gender divide. You put all of that together and you realize that for a vast section of India's population, the smartphone is the only way they were going to get online. It's not just that. For many of these Indians, the smartphone is not just an internet device. For most Indians, this is also their first camera. This is also their first Walkman and their first MP3 player and their first radio and their first calendar and their first alarm clock and so many more things, their first mapping device. That was just simply not available to them before. I know you may know all of these things. You live in India, and I often give this talk in the West, in America, in England, and to most people there it's a revelation, but I imagine for many of you, you live this, and so you see this and you know this. But the reason why I'm saying this to you is that, again, for those of us who live among India's 2%, you sometimes forget that life in India is not the same for everyone. And so I'm just trying to make that more visceral for you. So for the Indians who are discovering the internet on a smartphone, again, the other divide, apart from the ones I was talking about, was the English language. So again, I'm sure each and every one of you either went to an English medium school or you were very well versed with the English language because you've learned it and studied it in a way that is fairly privileged in India. In the year 2000, when there were 20 Indian internet users, 20 million Indian internet users, if you drew a Venn diagram between English speakers and internet users, the internet users circle would have fallen directly inside the English speakers circle. Again, this was privileged, rich, urban India. The internet of today actually has moved outside of the English speaker circle. So only 200 million Indians speak English. You may think that more Indians speak English, but that's not true. It's only 200 million. The new Indian internet users are users who can now use Hindi and Bengali and Marathi and Tamil and Telugu on their phones. Why? Because smartphones have softwares that allow you to, use different languages at the click of a button. It's not just that. You could also be illiterate and use a smartphone and use the internet. So, does anyone know how many illiterate people there are in India? Anyone want to take a guess? What was that there? 25 million? Anyone else? 25%. That's closer to the truth. It's 300 million is the number of people who are illiterate. So you take the entire population of the United States of America, which is 300 million, and that is the sum, the number of Indians who simply cannot read or write in any language at all. The internet, computing, modernity for them would have been a dream, right? It was never going to happen under a normal trajectory. Now, you have an illiterate person, you give them a phone, and they can actually press Google and say, okay, Google, mujhe Taj Mahal dikhao, and it shows them a video of the Taj Mahal in a way that I think is really quite powerful. And the first character in my book, her name is Fulwati, she actually plays that game with several rural illiterate women where she shows them the phone and gets them to speak to it. And this is a really powerful moment for them because for the first time, they're able to see the Taj Mahal in moving video imagery, but they're also able to connect with the world of the internet in a way that would have been impossible. So that's the reason why the smartphone, at least in terms of getting Indians online, is as revolutionary as it is. Why is this particular to India? Why is this not a big thing for other countries? The obvious comparison is with China, right? But China was getting rich before it got online. So the average Indian makes $2,000 a year or less than that. So that's about a 1,50,000. The average Chinese makes 4 times as much a year. The average Mexican makes 5 times as much a year. The average American makes 25 times as much a year. So that's how far behind the curve India is on median income. So China was getting rich before it got online. So China's experience was somewhere between a Western American experience and an Indian experience. The only real comparison with India is smaller countries that are around India's periphery, Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, and African countries. But of course, they're all countries and they're small and they're usually homogenous and people speak one language in those countries. India really is quite unique. There is no other place in the world that has so many people that are all discovering the internet in such a short space of time and that are so divided along so many different lines of male and female, urban, rural, rich and poor, upper caste, lower caste, religion, language, cuisine, culture, history, tradition. India is very divided along all of these lines. And the phone, in a sense, is allowing all of these people to, all at once, discover the internet, discover photography, discover video, discover TVs, discover content, discover streaming stuff, discover music. All of this truly is revolutionary. And not to belabor the point, but again, as established, you are all the 2%. So this is only an incremental difference for you. But for people who work in your homes, for your drivers, for people, real Indians in villages and the masses of Indians, this is truly transformative. Now, often when I describe why this is transformative for India, I like to use analogies of what this could mean for the moment India is in and if there are any historical comparisons of this. And one analogy that I often use is what America was going through in the 20th century. So you have this other big, boisterous democracy where people really wanted to change their country and rise and work hard and be meritorious. So in the 20th century, the Americans built the car, the early 20th century. And you build the car, and then what you need to do, you need to build roads, and you build highways, and you build the interstate system, and then you create tens of thousands of jobs. And then once you create all of that, you've now rebuilt the infrastructure of the country and you create suburbia. I mean, we have suburbs here as well, but these suburbs are new, right? So they came about because of the car. So the Americans built suburbia, they built the picket fenced home. Because of that, they then built the commute. So you're commuting into the cities to work. You have the commute, then along that journey, you're going to have an entire infrastructure of gas stations, drive in malls. You're going to have things like multiplexes, you're going to have movie theaters, you're going to have restaurants and diners, and you've built Americana and you've built all of these things. And then culturally, there's a range of things that are going to change as well. What are they? Well, with the car, you then have, for most young Americans, this is their first private space. This is their first private property. The car is enshrined in Hollywood. So if you've watched any 1960s, 1970s Hollywood movie, the car is enshrined in it, either with the chase or the race or the heist, or the actor and actress are going to have their first kiss in a car. The car, in many ways, defined modern America. The car also defined the American dream. The car was mobility, right? You think of what a car did. So if you're driving a sedan or a hatchback or a muscle car or a convertible, you know who you are. I can see the car you're driving and I know exactly who you are. I know whether you've come from far away. I know if you live in suburbia. I know if you have 3 kids. I know if you have no kids, if it's a 2-seater or a 4-seater or 2 doors. There's so much you can tell about a society from the cars that people use. So the car ended up building, in a sense, America. The car created a physical infrastructure and also an imaginative cultural infrastructure in America. And as I was saying, for most young Americans, it was a tool of mobility. This is what they built their dreams around. And when I moved to India in 2014, I was running CNN in India at the time. I began to wonder whether the smartphone will do the same thing for India, whether the smartphone will become the tool for mobility for young Indians. Remember, young Indians are average age 27. That's the median age in India, as opposed to America now, which is median age 50. Um, so, will the smartphone then create a physical infrastructure of jobs and education and an online marketplace that will transform some of the Indian economy, but also in a cultural, imaginative way? Will it change how Indians date? Will it change how Indians meet each other? Will it change how Indians communicate? Will it change with WhatsApp what we can do with each other and how news is disseminated? Will it change content? Will it change types of things? And that's what I began to wonder, and that's how the journey of my book began. There's one more thing I should relate to you, since you are an Indian audience and you would have seen this. The day I moved to India in March of 2014, this was right before the Indian elections. And do you all remember the idea Cellular Ads around about that time? They had this whole campaign around the elections. And I was struck by this one ad where there's a politician who's giving a speech in a village. And he's making tall claims. He's like, I'm going to give you electricity, I'll give you roads, and I'll give you water, and I'll build you bridges. And he's making tall claims like most politicians do. You're smiling, you've seen the ad. And the shot cuts to these 2 villagers, these young men. One of them pulls out his phone and he Googles the guy and he sees that the same politician made the same promises 5 years ago. So he shouts out, he's like, hey, Mantri ji, आपने तो ये सब promises 5 साल पहले भी किए थे. हम लोग को उल्लू समझ के रखे हैं क्या? And then there's another shot cut and people are throwing stuff at the politician and the ad jingle breaks out, no ullu banawing. And there are many versions of this ad. There's a version about this guy who's trying to get people to apply to colleges abroad, and there's a version where a taxi driver is taking a shortcut and the guy at the back says, nahi nahi, ye to long cut hai, ullu bana rahe ho. It really made me think, because especially the ad with the villagers, because if you think about it, 10, 15 years ago, that was impossible. It was impossible on many levels. One, for the ability to search, the ability to verify, the ability to fact check, the ability to be able to truth, to sort of verify whether what someone is saying is true or not live. But more than that, culturally, if you think about it, the politician was rich, was likely urban, was likely educated, was likely upper caste. The villagers were likely exactly the opposite. They were rural, they were likely poor, they were likely lower caste, and they were likely not educated, in the same way at least. And there's something about the impudence of being able to stop a minister and ask him that kind of a question. It wouldn't have happened in the India I grew up in 10 or 15 years, 20 years ago, but it's happening now. And it made me wonder that, is this because of the smartphone? Is the smartphone going to do more than just connect people? Is the smartphone going to give young Indians a confidence that they can do something more? That the son of a carpenter doesn't have to be a carpenter, that a young Indian who may not have access to an English medium education, or the riches that some of us have in India's cities, is still able to compete at a global level with global peers because they have the internet, because they have this tool that allows them to compete with their peers, that makes them equal. Is it an equalizing force? That's what began my journey to write this book. And the book has all of these different chapters. I look at the lives of women, which I'll get to in a second. I look at education and how that's transforming because of the smartphone. I look at jobs and how the entire industry of Ola and Uber and drivers who have these jobs, and the gig economy, and the fact that deliveries are expanding, and because of that there are so many other jobs being created. But at the same time, you also have the fact that jobs are being destroyed by the digital economy. Bricks and mortar stores are going away slowly, or at least they will. And then I move on from there to look at dating and marriage and dating apps. Any of you use dating apps over here? No one's got. People at the back are putting up their hands because no one can see them. But all of you use dating apps, and all of you are lies. Um, I have a chapter on pornography where I look at the explosion in pornography in India. I have a chapter on fake news and lynchings, and I know when we get to questions and answers, you're going to want to talk about that as well. I look at addictions and how it's one thing to imagine that the phone is going to improve everyone's life, but it's another thing when you look at data that shows that a lot of people in the West are now addicted to their phones. They suffer from a disease called nomophobia, which means no mobile phone phobia. Young children are showing increasing signs and rates of depression, even suicide among teenagers, all of which is linked to excessive uses of smartphones. So there's a lot of stuff that we need to worry about in India. There's also the overreach of the state. I mean, many of you know the Aadhaar debate over here and the debate over privacy, but there's more than that. India is also the number one state in the world that shuts down the internet, more than Syria, more than Iraq. And that's really not a badge of honor for India to wear, where it can just shut down the internet at places that it wants to. So there's a lot of good, there's a lot of bad. And the smartphone clearly is transformative, but it isn't a fix all. And that's a discovery that I made as I was reporting this book out and traveling around the country, mostly in villages. Most of the characters in my book are poorer Indians, again, because I think their story is the interesting story. Our story, richer Indians tend to have the same experience. You've all discovered the internet in the 90s. The lives you're living are very Western in the sense that if you went to Tokyo, or if you went to Mexico City, or you went to London, you will have a lot in common with rich people in those countries. But it's the middle classes in most countries that are very different from each other. And so that's where, as a journalist, the most interest is. I mean, those are the interesting stories that tell you where a country is headed. So there's a lot of that in the book. But one of the themes that runs throughout my book is the theme of trust. And the reason why I fell upon this theme as a fresh way of looking at where India is headed and what the smartphone is doing in India is because I was reading a book called Trust by Frank Fukuyama, the American political theorist. And the book is quite old. He wrote it in the late 80s, if I'm not mistaken. And the point he made was that you can divide up the world into high trust societies and low trust societies. So, a high trust society, for example, is Germany or Japan. And in those kinds of countries, you know that the trains are going to show up on time. You know that things around you are going to work. You know that when you tell someone to come and pick you up from the airport at 12:05 p.m., they will show up at 12:05 p.m. or earlier. You know that there are giant companies and conglomerates that just work. They have giant supply chains and they have the ability to trust each other to make things work in the right way. Think of giant German companies, giant South Korean companies, giant Japanese conglomerates. And he contrasts all of that with low trust countries. And low trust countries are the likes of, you know, parts of southern Italy, so Sicily or Taiwan or certain African countries. And the point he's making there is that things just don't work. Family businesses are small, you never have large companies because there's a lack of trust. People tend to hire within their caste and community and all of that. He doesn't mention India in that book, but India, for me, is a very low trust society, or at least it has been for the last 30, 40, 50 years. And there's so many examples of this. You look at the biggest Indian companies 10, 20 years ago, they were Birlas and Tatas and the Godreges and the Ambanis. And in the beginning, they tended to hire within their communities, so Gujaratis and Marwaris and Parsis. And all of that is beginning to change as India modernizes and as big companies get listed on stock exchanges and stuff like that. But the fact remains that India is largely a low trust society where we tend to trust based on language and culture and community and family ties and friends of friends and personal recommendations, much more than just a Western notion of professionalism or people doing what they're actually going to say they're going to do. Another example of that is showing up on time. So you all did show up on time, but in general, we all know that in India, if you want to meet someone at 10 a.m., you know they're probably going to show up at 10:15, maybe 10:30, and the excuses could range from there was traffic or I got delayed because of X, Y, and Z. And so Indians generally have a reputation of not being punctual. However, and one of my old professors at college, Kaushik Basu, told me about this once. There's a study showing that it's not in Indians' DNA to be late. It's actually economic incentive. So if you show up late for a meeting, you show up late because you know that the person you're meeting is likely going to show up late as well. So it's in your economic incentive to show up late. You put the same Indian in New York, and that Indian is likely going to show up on time because you will be penalized for not showing up on time. So, what does that tell you? What it tells you is that we Indians are not the problem. The problem is the system we're in. We're in a low trust system where you're penalized for being a high trust player. You're losing out on your own time. You see low trust in every aspect of your lives. So, for example, you all may have credit cards because, again, you are the rich 2%ers, 3%ers of India. But most Indians don't have credit cards. And that's in general because they don't trust them. They don't trust banks. And so, even though Uber in the West is seen as a company that is great for many reasons, um, geolocation tagging being the main one, but one of the reasons also is that you don't have to bother about cash. You just pay straight through your card. But in India, Ola, which you all know is Uber's bigger competitor here, it pays for 70% of its rides with cash. Even Uber has a majority of its ride payments done in cash. And that's largely because Indians don't trust the system. They don't trust banks, they don't trust the cards, they expect something to go wrong. I'll give you another example. In the West, most people have single SIM phones and they have contracts with their company, so postpaid connections, as you call them in India. Most people in India, and again, you may be the exception here, but most Indians have dual SIM phones and they have prepaid SIM cards. Why? Two reasons. One, you have a dual SIM phone because you may be using Geo on one and Vodafone on another, and you expect the Geo phone to break down, you expect the Vodafone to break down, so you like switching between them. That's, I mean, right? I mean, you tell me if you're wrong, but that's why most Indians tend to use dual SIM phones. Or they like to pick and choose offers. Geo has a good offer right now, Vodafone has a good offer tomorrow. There's that. And then there's prepaid accounts. And the reason why prepaid accounts are so big here is because people, again, you don't trust Geo, so you want to hedge your bets with Vodafone and Airtel. That's one. But you may not know this, but the companies don't trust you either, because they don't trust your credit. In America, AT&T and T and Verizon know that if they sign you up, they have you on the cosh. They're going to get their money from you because there's the social security system, there's the banking system. They trust the courts, they can go after you, collection agencies will go after you. They will get their money. And if they don't, there's insurance. They'll be fine. In India, no one trusts the system. And so Airtel and Jio, they don't even like postpaid accounts. They'd much rather do prepaid because they know you're going to pay. It's prepaid. They've got the money in hand. So given that we know that India is as low trust as it is, what is the smartphone going to do? Is the phone going to make India a high trust society? A lot of people will tell you that that's the case. I don't think that's the case. I think, as with all things, as with every technology, in the same way that electricity and the car and TVs have changed the world, the phone and the smartphone will change India. It will be a catalyst for things that are already happening. So the reason why India will go from low trust to high trust is that it will become richer. As it becomes more industrialized and more educated, things will get better. And that's a normal trajectory for any economy. China went through that over the last 20 years. Singapore went through that. South Korea went through that. And that's the same trajectory that India will have to go through. The phone will speed things up, but it isn't a fix-all. And that's very important for us to know, because in all of these ads that I was talking about, the idea ad and every single sponsorship in India, for the cricket team, for Bollywood movies, the billboards you see all around you, they are either of internet companies or they are of smartphone companies. And there's this notion, I mean, think of the Jio ad, Kar lo dunya apni muthi mein. There's this notion that technology is going to fix everything around you. That's not true. Technology is going to help. Technology will revolutionize. Technology will be a game changer for people who are very poor and rural and have been cut off for a variety of reasons. But it isn't a fix all. And to think it is a fix all is a dangerous thing for all of you, because what that does, when you put too much hope, when you invest too much in a system or a technology, it's going to let you down. And that's why, even though much of my book is positive, looking at the impacts on education, looking at how good this is for people who are illiterate and how it is an equalizing force, it is also a divisive force. So if you look at the echo chambers we're creating in the media, where you can listen to exactly what you want to listen to through social media, if you look at the explosion in fake news, and fake news is very dangerous, especially in India, because people are more gullible in India. And I don't mean this in a bad way. All of you discovered the internet in the late 1990s, so you'll remember when you got your first Hotmail email account, you would get chain mails. Remember chain mails? So people will send you an email saying, if you don't forward this to 10 people, you'll be unlucky in love. And then you forward it to 10 people. And then one friend will say, hey, you're stupid, don't do this again, it's a superstition. And then you learn from that mistake, right? So you've learned these things because you've evolved with the internet. You're less gullible because you've been trained, you're educated. For most Indians, they are learning about the chain mail in one go. Hundreds of millions of people are going through this moment within a very short space of time. And that's why you have an explosion in WhatsApp forwards. That's why you have an explosion in fake news and deep fake videos, which can go from, spread exponentially like wildfire in India. And that can cause lynchings and Hindu-Muslim mob violence and so many other things. So even though we're in this moment of immense optimism and positivity about what technology can do, I would caution that this is also a moment where a lot could go wrong, especially for people who may not be sensitized to technology or to modernity in the same way. And so, and I'm going to wrap up soon so we can take some questions as well. But um, it's important to know that as India begins to modernize more and as more people discover the internet, it's very important to push the government and to push even the private sector to focus a little bit more on digital literacy. Because in the same way that the Indian government used to have all these ads on not drinking and driving or wearing seat belts, the car as a very powerful tool of mobility is also a weapon of mass destruction. And I think it's important to begin to see the smartphone in the same way, which goes against the grain of the ads that you're seeing every day on TV and on billboards. But the smartphone is something that we need to learn how to use. We need to be sensitized in terms of what it's doing to our lives, how easily we're addicted to them, what that does to our brains and our minds. There's an increasing amount of data in the West now, especially in America, where studies show linkages between excessive smartphone use and suicide. So, young teenagers, especially in America, are growing up very differently from the way you and I grew up. They, in the 60s and 70s, Americans would hit the teenage years and they'd really want to learn how to drive. They would go to malls and hang out, and, that's where they'd socialize and make their mistakes and learn things. Young Indian teens today, they don't need to leave their homes because they can sit in bed and they can have these long conversations with friends all over the world, but also in their locality. So they can live their lives in their pajamas sitting at home. They don't go to the mall anymore. They don't want to learn how to drive anymore. If they need to get somewhere, there's Uber. Um, so all of this has linkages with how societies are changing in America. And there's a lot of data showing that that is not necessarily a good thing. It's dangerous. India hasn't fully realized that this is going to come, that this moment will come where too much technology is a bad thing. And when that moment arrives, it will arrive, as things do in India, in an explosion. It'll arrive in a way where, the kinds of mob violence that you're seeing or the cases of lynching will just multiply exponentially. And that's something I think for all of us to be very aware of and very careful of, because again, in this moment of optimism, it's important to have a cautious optimism and to think of technology in a more holistic way in terms of how it could damage us as well. And then I also mentioned internet shutdowns. Do any of you know what internet shutdowns are? Anyone? So in the state of Kashmir, for example, anytime there is a terror attack or what they call an encounter, the government has the ability to switch off the internet, and it can do it in a very localized way. So it can, shut it off on just one street or a particular town or even the entire state if it wants to. India has more internet shutdowns than any other country on earth. And again, I think for civil society and for Indians at large, it's very important to think about again that technology is so optimistic, but think about how the state can use it against you. And what worries me about this is that, on the one hand, you could argue that the state does need to police, it does need to ensure that things don't get out of hand. So if there's a bomb blast outside here, they can cordon off the road, right? And people who argue for shutting down the internet say, well, if there's a bomb blast, you should shut comms down so people can't share bad stuff, or, they can limit the amount of panic. And there's truth to that argument. But there's a real danger of going the other extreme. And many would say the Indian state has gone the other extreme because there's no reason for it to shut down the internet more than Syria or more than Iraq or more than Pakistan. And that's bad. And if you don't police these rights, if you don't police what the state is allowed to do, you'll lose a lot of the rights that you have. And so today it's shutdowns, tomorrow certain types of content won't be allowed, the day after, your political views could be monitored. Look at China again. China has created an entire social credit system where it's able to monitor your behavior. It's able to monitor, how fast you're driving, but not only that, how you're performing at work, and it's able to rate that and then give you things in return for that, including political loyalty. So it's a dangerous moment we're in where connectivity is so useful, and much of my book is about the benefits that India is going to see, and those benefits are absolutely undeniable. But for those of us who are lucky to have been, the first ones to use the internet in India, as most of you are, I think it's important to also remember that there are many freedoms that we have that we need to keep fighting for. And one of those freedoms is the freedom of speech, the freedom to use the internet as you want. India, famously, as you know, protected net neutrality, which allows it to keep the internet as a free internet and not as a gated internet, which America now has through net neutrality. So it's important to, all at once, to see the internet as a tool for good, but to also see it as a freedom that needs to be protected. And I think that's a very important thing for India moving forward. I'm going to say one more thing then before I wrap up and take some questions from you all. One of the things, one of the big domains that I think the West is very interested in India for is the e-commerce market, and whether India is going to create more jobs or whether the Indian economy will be transformed because of smartphones and the e-commerce market. There's a lot of ways of thinking about this, but as I was saying earlier, on the one hand, uh, India needs to create at least 1 million jobs a month to keep up with young Indians who are joining the workforce. We know that there's going to be a shortfall in this creation of jobs. So basically, the state is not able to create enough jobs. There are some research that shows and some data that show that the e-commerce market will bridge some of the gap in job creation in India. So, for example, as the size of the e-commerce market grows, currently it's about 25 billion. China's is way more in the 200 billion range. So as India's e-commerce market grows, as all of you buy more things online, you shop online, you conduct more business online, there will be more jobs created because of that. And what are these jobs? These jobs are mostly packing and warehousing jobs, and they are delivery jobs. And if you think about it, the labor profile of the average blue-collar Indian worker really suits those kinds of jobs that are being created, right? So on the one hand, that's a good thing. And then, as I was saying, Uber and Ola have created hundreds of thousands of jobs in India. So those are good things as well. But there's a lot of bad that will come with this, and that includes the destruction of brick and mortar stores. Once automation and mechanization take off in Indian factories, that will destroy a lot of jobs as well. And all of that is linked to the growth of the e-commerce market and the growth of the internet industry in India. So that's something that is deeply worrying, but also has immense potential in India, and is something that investors in the West are looking at very closely. But all of that comes back to the fact that ultimately what will grow the Indian market is you all consuming and the middle class consuming and paying for content. So the more you shop online and the more you spend, the more that market grows. The more poorer middle class Indians spend online, the more those markets grow. So, for example, how many of you here subscribe to Netflix? Right, so it's about 50-50. Netflix doesn't have very many subscribers in India. I think it's around about 2, 3, 400,000. They need many more subscribers in India to survive and to thrive. And ultimately, this is the bet that everyone is making in India. All the big investors who are coming in, and including the likes of Reliance Jio, which has invested so much money in India. The bet is that you will consume. The bet is that you will pay for content. The bet is that all of the things you're paying for today, tomorrow, you will pay for them online. You will trust the system. You will use digital money. You will consume more and more. The Indian middle class will grow. And through all of that, India itself will develop and become more of a middle income country instead of the poor country that it is today. And that will lead to a transformation in India and a general rise in the Indian economy. Where does the smartphone fit into this? That's what my book is about. And ultimately, I argue that this is net a positive force. It's something we need to be cautiously optimistic about. There's a lot that could go wrong, but as with any technology, it is neutral. It is not good, it's not bad, but it isn't neutral either. You need to channel it in the right way. So I'm going to leave you with that thought. Thank you very much for letting me speak. I'm going to take a few questions, and then I'm going to be signing books downstairs. So, thank you.